how's it going? Susan Ruth here. Thanks for listening to another episode of Hey Human Podcast. This is episode 145. I recorded it in Schenectady, New York last summer, and I sat down in Union College in the kitchen of my friend Yasmin and had a conversation with Dr. Kaywana Raeburn, and she is an assistant professor of behavioral economics at Union College. Very interesting woman, and as some of you might be thinking, economics, how can there be a podcast about economics? That is vaguely interesting to me if I'm not into economics. And I promise you, there was some really interesting stuff in there. She did not get too heady with me, thank goodness. So it was a fun conversation. We talked about all sorts of things, about the global impact of a singular person, about farming, about women in STEM. We talked about games that behavioral psychologists play to learn about people. And I don't know, it was really cool and interesting. I enjoyed myself. And she referenced some cool books, which in fact I am getting this week. And all those books that she referenced, of course, I put on the links page on heyhumanpodcast.com. So Dr. Raeburn and I had a really great chat. I do want to have a little moment to reference the fact that within our conversation, I made an offhanded comment about, I think it was about rats, saying that, about their decision-making skills, that it's not like a human's. And that's actually incorrect. And I know that that's incorrect, so I'm not even sure why I said that in the conversation. And in a weird twist of fate, today, my friend Dr. Brian Swice, who actually was on Hey Human episode 77, he and I were chatting. I asked him if he had read a particular book that Kaywana had referenced, that Dr. Raeburn had brought up, and he had read it. And in fact, then he sent me this citation about that references Brian's work, and in it was a comment about, or the whole section of the citation was talking about how rodents perceive future events based on reward or punishment. And all that to say is, rats are people too. And I denied that moment for ratdom everywhere. So I wanted to correct that. I'm super nerding out right now. But anyway, so I had a great conversation with Dr. Raeburn, and there was a lot of ambient noise during our conversation. I did my best to weed some of that stuff out, but certainly there'll be a couple moments where you might be distracted, and I hope that you hang in there because it's worth the listen. In other news, of course, my usual stuff, the links page I mentioned already has tons of great references from this episode, the links page from heyhumanpodcast.com. Also, if you are an Amazon person and you shop on Amazon, please do so through the Amazon portal on heyhumanpodcast.com. It helps support Hey Human, which I appreciate very much. Please rate and review Hey Human on iTunes because that helps a ton. Speaking of iTunes, if you're into music, you can find my music under Susan Ruth on iTunes. Yes, it's true. I do lots of different things, and music is one of them. What else? Social media. Hey Human Podcast is on Facebook. It's on Instagram. And I personally am on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Is that all of them? I don't know. Under Susan Ruthism. You can email me, susan@heyhumanpodcast.com. I'd love to hear from you. And I think that's all the stuff. I'm sure I'm missing something, but I'm always missing something. So we must do what we must do. All right. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being you and being in the world and being a human. And rats are people too. Here we go. Hi, Kaywana Raeburn. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. It's really good.
Thank you for being on Hey Human. You are a professor of
economics.
Yeah.
I guess specifically behavioral economics is my job title.
Yeah, I'm going to move this just a hair closer to you because I'm loud.
Yes, and I do have a tendency to sometimes be a little
quieter.
So,
yeah. Behavioral economics, when I was reading, I read up on you, obviously, a tad. I don't like to do it too much because I really want the conversation to be organic. But what exactly, I kept looking at that behavioral, and I found one paper where I was able to read the first paragraph. It's all, the academic papers are all on lockdown, so you need codes and things.
It's like journals are hard to get access to.
Which is a real bummer.
Even sometimes as an academic, there's some, like, unless the library system has access to, say, and there's some that I use in my classes that I can't get the papers to.
Which is strange. You would think that knowledge would be provided regardless.
Yeah, and it's not every academic who has a finding that makes it to the news.
Yeah.
So it's really hard sometimes to get your story out there.
I'm going to hack that system so that I can read some of these papers. But the little bit that I did, so first of all, explain what behavioral economics is, because I think a lot of people don't have any clue. Economics, everyone's like, oh yeah, I know what that is. But
So behavioral economics is really the introduction of insights from psychology, from sociology, from anthropology into what was the standard economic theory. So most economists in the past would say a human and an individual making decisions is self-interested, only cares about maximizing their own outcomes or their own utility without really taking into consideration anything else. And with behavioral economics, there's a lot of findings that show that maybe people don't really make decisions in that way. There's a lot of what we call anomalies that don't quite fit with the standard economic theory. And so behavioral economics kind of birthed from incorporating some of these anomalies into economic theory.
It seems strange that there was a time that the standard is to not look at all these other influences, and so many things impact our decision-making skills from day to day.
True. So I guess for economists, especially when we're building models, we try to simplify the reality into a framework that's easy to, or at least as easy as possible to kind of get insights. And a lot of the times we see these agents or individuals as having very similar preferences, and really it's because we're trying to get some insight without cluttering the model too much. And as you get higher and higher in economics, it becomes a lot more mathematical, and getting mathematical models that can in at least some way capture the things that we're interested in finding out. It's difficult with a lot of the things that we consider as individuals when we make decisions.
What brought you to this field? Because I don't know, especially as a woman, right? Women are not, the statistically, women in math, they don't go to the parties together. Turn this up a little bit more. So what was it that drew you to it?
So I guess in economics in general, we do have an underrepresentation of women. So about 20 to 30% of PhD graduates are women, and as it goes higher and higher, say at the assistant professor, associate professor, the numbers and the percentages drop. And that's something that as a department at Union College we have been trying to see, how do we get more women to come into the major and trying to make it more women friendly. We actually had an event yesterday with an alumni who came and talked about what she wished she knew. She wished she knew before getting her first job, which was a really interesting talk. But for me, I started in economics, I guess partly because I liked math. This was a really long time ago, but so I'm from Grenada in the Caribbean, and we follow the British system, or very similar to the British system in terms of education. So after you do high school, which finishes at like 16 years old, you would go to a 2-year college where you do A-levels, which is British, but also you do an associate degree. And there I studied math, economics, computing, and accounting. And I really was going to study math and computing at college. But then I worked in the Ministry of Finance in Grenada, which is really the part of the government that deals with economic policies and things like that, and that really got me interested in studying economics further. So I did that as my undergrad and my master's, and did my PhD. I got involved in a project on food security in the Caribbean, where part of it was using economic experiments to try to see why farmers don't adopt new technologies very much. And that's kind of what got me interested in moving from economics in general to experimental and behavioral economics.
It's really interesting to me that you can take an economic model and somehow put it on the way humans think or feel. It lends itself to the idea that we are a computer up here, right? In a way,
yeah, to some extent, yeah.
That we follow these patterns, and that the human brain is pattern based in its.
Well, I guess the idea is that everyone's probably has different preferences and heterogeneous preferences, but on average, maybe this model can capture aggregate behavior. And if you pick someone from randomly from the population, maybe this model might explain their behavior, maybe not, but on average in the population, maybe this has some sort of explanatory power.
So what did you find with the farmers? Why did they not wish to
So that's a finding in development economics a lot, that in developing countries there's what we underutilization of new technologies. And the project that I was working on, we were seeing whether framing the choice to adopt a new technology as providing information as a public good to others makes a difference in people's decision making, and it didn't seem to make a difference. But what we did find was that the farmers actually learned from information in the way that you'd expect. So if you had good outcomes, they would gravitate towards the new technology of sorts. If they had bad outcomes, that they would gravitate away from it.
That makes sense.
Which makes sense. So providing information and having that information potentially be organically provided might be a way to increase that, assuming, of course, that we want adoption of new technologies, which also can be potentially a contentious.
When you speak to new technology, you're talking about antibiotic and things like that, because these are small farms you're talking about, right?
So sometimes it's just getting a new variant of a crop that they're already doing.
Sure.
Or it might be new equipment, it might be new fertilizer. So it really depends on the situation. The farmers that we were working with were small cash crop farmers, so it would be those types of innovations there.
Do you, is one of your specialties then to deal with women farmers? Are there very many of those?
So not necessarily my specialty in terms of the types of farmers, but with our sample and the farmers we were working with, we did have a high proportion. About 40% of the people who participated in our experiment were women. That's less representative of the area. This was in Guyana, which is in South America and part of the Caribbean. I think it's probably more around 25 to 30% of the farmers are women, but also because it's households. So in the household, you'd have both the man and the woman who typically run the farm together. The
family
husband,
farm type situation.
Exactly. So husband probably has more decision-making weight, but it's still a unit that performs that job.
Is that a pretty even killed family dynamic, or is it still pretty patriarchal? Or?
Well, I wouldn't want to speak too much about, because I'm not an expert, especially for the Guyanese situation. They do have a lot of these extended family type situations where you have generations of family living in the same household. I'm not an expert there.
It's funny, Americans really eschew that, and yet, a lot of the immigrant families are still, that's a huge part of the life, and it seems to me so logical to have these large family units. It seems like so much healthier as far as your mental well-being, the natural, the innate tribalism that people have, all that stuff to have. You have the elders that can raise the babies and and all that. It just makes so much sense.
Yeah, and that's something we don't see very much in the typical U.S. family. And there's actually a large Guyanese population in Schenectady.
Interesting.
Living in Guyana, I was there for 3 months in one period, in about 3 weeks, and it was familiar yet different from where I grew up in Grenada, which is a tiny island, 100,000 people. So sometimes you really get to see the similarities and the differences in terms of how people go about their daily lives, composition of the population, like the dynamic between different people.
Yeah, and the politics that surrounds each region, and
exactly,
and then the influence and history, dark history of
So Grenada itself has some interesting history. Some Americans would remember it from the 1980s with the 83 when the Reagan administration went in after overthrow of sorts of the already revolutionary government. Yeah. So,
were you there then?
No.
You don't seem that old.
No, I was not. I was actually born the year after.
Okay.
In 1984, but my parents were there. My grandfather actually was imprisoned by the revolutionary government for a few years because he was part of the previous government.
Right.
And it's interesting hearing stories, and everybody has their different perspectives about what happens. Just the way that time in history is called. Some people would call it an invasion. Some people would call it an intervention. So it kind of like...
What does your grandfather call it?
He died a few years in 1993, I think. But I think he leant more on the intervention side of the stream. But like for me, it's difficult delving into that.
The politics of it, yeah.
The politics of it, because it's complex.
It is.
It's complex.
I agree with that.
And there've been a few like truth and reconciliation committees, but looking back, I'm not sure that we've actually delved and healed as much as we think we have from.
Yeah. Well, I think not only do things like that affect people culturally as it moves on through, but genetically. I really do. I think that something gets altered in one's... I mean, I'm being a little bit, woo-woo about it, but I do think that it alters one's DNA, how one feels about things, and then that gets passed down.
Yeah.
Let's get back to the farming thing. I'm sort of focused on that because I do find it really fascinating, especially in a modern industrialized world where how people farm, for example, here versus other places, and that I think that we could probably learn a lot from some of those smaller farms about how they cultivate their soils, and we've forgotten, I think, some of the old school techniques to our detriment, and now the food is got a lot of issues, and we turn more and more to science and all that, but so I know you're not a farmer, so you're looking at I'm not a farmer. I know you're not a farmer.
I'm not sure how much insight I can give into the actual farming.
So when I tried to access some of your articles and couldn't, I had to glean just from what little bit I could read, but it did look like the women in agriculture and economics is something that is important to you, that you speak to, because I saw your name referenced in all these things. I just couldn't read them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So we, myself and a number of colleagues we haven't really gotten to the paper in a while, but we were doing a paper on gendered agriculture within Guyana and St. Lucia and some of the other countries we worked with. So this was not my project, but it was part of that larger project that it was that overarched the entire thing. And one of my colleagues, she did a lot of focus groups with women farmers, trying to see like insights in terms of decision-making powers within the household and bargaining and things like that. And overall, and these were, I think, two countries she looked at, St. Lucia and Guyana, it was similar in terms of the types of issues and things that they found relevant. And as I talked a little bit about bargaining power within the household and how much do women have in terms of decision making with what is planted on farms, for example. Do they have their own plots that they work on separately from their spouse or their partners? And in development economics, there's also a lot of work looking at decision making within these types of smaller households. It's been a while since I've looked at the paper. We're supposed to be starting work on it again this year. But from what I remember, at least with the farmers we worked with, there was relatively high amounts of decision-making power in terms of women versus men within the household. And it might be just this population and not necessarily extends to different part of the world.
So my next question, of course, would be why?
That's a good question. It might be culturally. It might be, because I'm thinking from my own experience and growing up in Grenada, I've never felt that there's significantly high barriers in terms of the possibilities and the opportunities for women and their ability to achieve different things. I didn't grow up in a farming household, so I can't speak to that and whether that's different from my own perception growing up. So it might be something about the culture and the norms of the area.
So that's speaking to the why within those family units, but why do we care? Do you know what I mean? I think that's a really, if you're just talking to the average person on the street, I know that there's significance to these things, but I think most people are like, why are you doing this? What is it? What's it going to lead to? What's the plan?
So I guess the why for me kind of harkens back to economics, and just if people's potentials aren't fully realized, that means that we're not as productive as a society as we could be. So I think that's the overarching why that...
You mean globally or locally?
Globally and locally.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so like on a community level, on a country level, globally. Okay. Without people being as productive as they can be, that just means that there's some output, there's some unrealized scope that's not happening. So it's kind of...
There is I think, unfortunately, a framework that people adhere to that they don't understand that when something good is happening somewhere across the planet, it does affect, it eventually ripples out, and communities that get stronger and more connected, more vibrant, more self-sustaining, that affects everyone.
Yeah. We're such a connected world that eventually something that happens halfway across the world will have some sort of ripple effect.
Yeah, I believe that 100%. Yeah. So where are you headed with your work? What is it? What's the grand plan?
Good question. So I'm currently trying to formulate a sort of project that kind of works and looks at stereotype threat, which is this psychological phenomenon that when we become more aware or like unconsciously or consciously about these stereotypes about our group, that can potentially negatively affect our performance. So looking to see whether that affects decision making in different ways, and potentially whether it affects people's propensity to compete in different things.
Like womanness or blackness or Grenada-ness or whiteness or Russianness or whatever.
So a lot of the work has been done with gender, race. There's some papers that have looked at age, for example, so age-related stereotypes to see whether that affects people's decisions. And I think the first set of work on that started looking at, I believe it was race, and whether making salient the stereotypes about race affected students' performance in math and English type tests. And it found that it did.
Oh yeah, that was a big old yes.
Yeah, and
unfortunately,
and then they started looking at gender, and they also found that. And you mentioned women in math earlier, so there's this stereotype that women aren't good at math, or at least not as good at math as men.
A cultural bias begins, even if it's unconscious, by the educators where...
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
that's real stuff. I think people hear about things like that and they think, oh, that's crazy. Nobody does that.
But
absolutely.
It's like unconscious.
Yes,
and
it's
that's
completely
the thing.
Unconscious.
And
that's the whole point is you don't even know you're doing it.
Yeah. So there's a lot of work on that within psychology and sociology. There's starting to be some work in that in economics. That's something I'm trying to pursue. I have a student who will be doing a summer research fellow with me, and she's interested in how different framings of stereotype threat can affect people's decision making. So there's a paper, 2013 paper, that looked at stereotype threat in people's financial decision making as measured as
that's interesting.
Risk aversion and loss aversion.
Within the American culture or elsewhere?
Yeah, it was with an American population.
Yeah.
So loss aversion has to do with the phenomenon of people disliking losses more than they like similar sized gains. So if you lose $5, it would hurt a lot more than if you get $5 would feel good to you.
Oh, interesting.
So that's actually one of those anomalies that psychology has brought into the economic literature and the economic thought. And risk aversion just has to do with people's preference for things that are less risky than, say, more risky.
Are they aligning that with race and gender, or are they just
so they looked at gender. So they did a study where they kind of framed the task that people were doing as either being a task that men or boys did better at than women versus having no framing at all. And they found that when stereotype threat was present, women were more risk averse and more loss averse than they would be otherwise. And that could potentially affect people's financial decision making because you might not make worthwhile investments because you are afraid of the possible risk.
That makes sense. I mean, I look at the idea of playing in stocks and things, and I'm like, nope.
It seems like I know for sure. I'm a very risk-averse person. So that study found that stereotype threat did affect people's risk and loss aversion. So she's interested in whether the way that you frame the stereotype threat, so is it that boys or men exert more effort in the task, or is it because they have an innate ability to do math versus women? So does that framing make a difference in terms of people's decision making?
It's interesting.
So that's something we'll be working on over the summer.
I know I've read some studies from the 70s, so it's a long time ago. I'm sure things are different, but about the gender of male having a more apt to take risks in general, just leaping off the tops of the roofs and the things like that, and while the little boys are playing Superman, jumping off the roof, and the little girls are like, you are crazy, get down from there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I climbed trees, but the roof was a little too much for me.
Yeah, and there's actually studies in economics more recently, experimental economics, which tries to measure people's risk preferences, and a consistent finding is that women tend to be more risk averse than men, as measured through these different risk aversion tasks.
Yeah.
So that still does exist. There's also studies that show that women tend to be less competitive. So the way that that's normally captured is you have the participants in the experiment do some sort of task. It could be, say, like adding up 2-digit numbers, and then they have to decide for a subsequent task what type of compensation they prefer. One might be a piece rate. So you get piece rate. Okay. So you get paid based on the number that you get correct. Or one might be a tournament or competition where you're paired or matched with 2 or 4 other people, and you get paid based on your performance relative to the other individuals. So we measure competition by how likely it is that the individual opts into the competitive task versus the piece rate task. And with studies like that, a consistent finding is that women are less likely to opt to compete versus being paid based on their own performance. So within this fair competition, risk aversion, loss aversion, there's a lot of findings in economics that suggest that women tend to be less competitive, more risk averse, more loss averse than men.
It's interesting. I wonder if that just comes down to chemicals in the body.
Maybe. What was interesting, I recently went to a symposium on economic experiments in developing countries, and one of the keynote speakers, Alessandra Cassar, she did a talk called Femina Economica.
And
which
was super catchy. It sounds like a superhero.
And she did kind of delve into some of the biological and genetical factors, but she has done some studies, particularly in the competition frame, where it might not be that women are less competitive than men. It might be what are the incentives that we have with our experiments. So typically it's you get paid money based on your performance in the task. But perhaps if it's not money, but for example, a voucher that you can use to buy books and school supplies for your child, then they found that in these cases, women actually tended to be, if not as competitive, then possibly even more competitive than men. So it might be that
when you're nurturing someone else, and
exactly
suddenly your competition,
exactly,
the mama bear feeling, and all
exactly.
that. Yeah.
So it might not be that there's this innate competitive preference or competitive gene, for lack of a better word, but it's really what is the
motivation,
environment of the competition.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Exactly.
For sure.
And as economists, we typically, like in experiments, we incentivize using money for the most part. So because we're doing that, are we actually not capturing a full sense of someone's risk aversion, for example, because we're only looking at it in a particular domain, not in another one.
Do you remember the marshmallow experiment?
Yes.
From psychology. Is that?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So that actually led to a lot of work in economics to see, okay, with our theory, like this, I was actually just teaching this a few weeks ago, discounted utility theory, we assumed that people would weigh future options consistently over time, whereas consistent finding in experiments is that people don't do that. So we have what we call inconsistent preferences over time, or time inconsistency. If you're deciding between, it's a good example, you're deciding, what was the authors of that study? So we had individuals choose, or they had individuals choose between a snack that they'd want to eat the next week, and they had to choose between a healthy snack and an unhealthy snack. When they were choosing a week in advance, about 70% said, we'll choose the healthy snack. When the time actually came, that proportion flipped. So now more people chose the healthy snack versus the unhealthy. The
unhealthy over this healthy.
Over the healthy snack.
So their impulse kicked in.
But our economic theories at the time would say that this type of behavior shouldn't happen.
Really?
So that's one way. So that's actually one field in which having these insights from psychology and these experimental results actually led to an adaptation of the theory. So now there's economic theories that account for the fact that maybe people are super impatient in the short run and have these impulses versus in the longer term decisions where they're more patient.
It's funny when you think about food as well, because I think that especially with things that are sweet or sugary, sugary or salty or whatever, that there's some part of your brain, the drug-seeking brain goes, that looks way better in the moment. That impulse thing. There's a lot of research being done right now in neuroscience about impulse and why the brain makes its decision to go left or right. And mice, there's a lot of mice experiments where you're training the mice. Oh, this is healthy. Look at this reward you get, and then you throw something sugary, and they're like forget about it. I'm out for the sugar.
Yeah, and there's a lot of bringing neuroscience into economics. There's a new field of sorts called neuroeconomics. I'm not very well read in that field, but there is that, and trying to tie people's decision making to what's happening in the brain, what's happening with our hormones, what's happening with the chemicals in our body. So, which
makes total sense to me. All of it, all these interdisciplinary theories, it makes sense that you would use those because we are very complex.
Yes.
I mean, yes, we're also very basic. Food, sex, sleep, that stuff, but the fact, was it hard to get these various, I mean, you can only speak to your own experience, but hard to get these various disciplines to start talking to each other? Because I know that a lot of times, especially in academia, everyone's like, no, my thing is the coolest. Y'all don't know what you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, I think with behavioral economics, it's getting more and more accepted within the wider economic discipline as being a legitimate way of approaching things, but I think in the beginning there are a lot of obstacles, and why do we care about these things? That's just maybe an aberration. So, but I think it's becoming more accepted, and it's actually there's within popular culture, it's becoming one field of economics that's getting a lot more attention. The Nobel Prize winner this year in economics, Richard Thaler, he is a behavioral economist, one of the fathers of behavioral economics, and Dan Ariely is another name that you'll hear a lot. He's a psychologist at Duke. He also wrote a number of books that, like Predictably Irrational and
Predictably Irrational.
Yes.
That's a great title.
It was a great title.
And have you read it?
Yes, I have. I've used it in my intro to behavioral economics.
Sounds like
I think that'll be a great book. That
a good reference. I'll read that.
Richard Thaler also has a number of books. He has one called Nudge with Cass Sunstein, which looks at how you can use small changes in the environment to kind of nudge people into doing what things that might be more beneficial for them. And that in itself is a kind of controversial.
I imagine that was actually going to be.
And it was, I think, when it came out, there was a lot of press on this.
Yeah.
And Cass Sunstein went on to be, I think it was in the Obama administration, advising the healthcare bill. And and he was kind of an advocate for using some of these nudges within trying to get people to, for example, save more for retirement. That's one of the examples they use in the book a lot. Just changing the way in which the options are presented. So if you go to a new job, you have the option to get a retirement plan. Do you have to opt in to the plan, or do you have to opt out of the plan? So if it's an opt-in situation where you have to make that active decision to opt into the plan, a lot less people actually do, versus an opt-out situation where you have to make the active decision to opt out of it. So that's one of the small changes.
Well, and that model is used in so much.
And marketing.
It's like that is the key.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, we put you on this list, but you don't have to be on this list if you don't want to.
Exactly.
And most people won't take the time to, because it's just like, It's funny that you brought up Nudge right before I was going to ask, what about the Prime Directive? Everything goes back to Star Trek for me.
Actually, I'm not very well.
No, it's okay. The Prime Directive is, just to make it as general as possible, is that you just don't mess with cultures that are becoming. You don't instill your own ideology and politics and all that stuff. But I think, again, this is a complicated issue in that how do you go in and say to another culture that maybe isn't as far along and say, hey, there's some ideas, but without getting in the way of their own natural
organically
growth, because that's important too for a culture. That weird superimposing of, especially American, the British, all that stuff. How do you stay out of your own way, I guess, in these works?
That's a difficult question, and you gotta really weigh okay, what you think is the benefits of what you're trying to do versus what's the potential harm of what you're trying to do. And it's difficult choices to make sometimes.
I think a good example of that just here in this country, for example, is the healthcare, right? Here was Obama and all the team work, you know, I mean, it was coming a long time, and they're like, okay, here's this healthcare, it's not perfect, but this is what you're going to do. And there was a mass outcry, like, I don't want to pay this, I don't want to, you know. There was, but because I think there was a lack of understanding, partially. And a lot of rhetoric from both sides, obviously, the talking heads on either side. And then people just get shut down. I think that the anxiety of trying to figure things out.
Yeah, and as an ordinary citizen, you're getting so much information, it's being bombarded at you. How do you filter and how do you sieve through this to kind of, get to the crux of it? Is this going to help me? Is it not? And what might be the different ways that this can affect my life?
Yeah, so it's surprising to me with all these very learned people like yourself who are trying to help people understand all these different models, that when it comes down to it, nobody does it. They're not actually putting these things into place in order to help people understand what's going on. You know, going back to the beginning of our conversation with the farmers, what were the chances? You know, what was the percentage of people that were like, oh, you know what, this seed is good in really windy weather or really hot weather, or, you know, whatever it is.
So the farmers that we worked with, so just to clarify a little bit, the actual experiment that we did was, as an economist would approach it, an abstraction from their actual decisions in the field. So it was, we did a task which we thought was analogous to having that decision.
Staying out of their way, in other words.
Exactly. Part of the experiment itself was the participants had to discuss, or they could talk about the task that they were doing. Some people actually did relate it to, if I'm choosing this risky lottery versus this one where I don't really know what the outcomes might be, it's kind of similar to, if I'm choosing a new crop, I don't know what the outcomes can potentially be, versus I've been using this variety of tomatoes for 20 years. I pretty much know if we have really good weather, it's going to have this amount. If we have terrible weather, we're going to have that amount. So they did kind of relate it to the task. With those farmers, the organization that we worked with in Guyana, that's the National Agricultural Research and Extension Institute, they do work with farmers directly, and what they have are these demonstration plots where, so if there's a new variety of cassava, for example, that they would want farmers to potentially adopt because it gives higher yield than the one they currently do, they have these demonstration plots where the farmers can come see, they know what the output is, so that provides information to them. So I think that's one way, kind of getting that information that's important to informing their decisions.
Teach a man to fish, kind of thing. Yeah, interesting. It is, I'm always curious about experiments and theories and all these things, because when you do, say you have A is how somebody is behaving and acting and living their life, but we're going to do the experiment over here in B, then you have a loss, right? You have a loss of information, you have a loss of reality. So, and then that's when the theory comes in, right? And you have to go, okay, well, it's not exact.
Yes. And I'm actually teaching an experimental economics course this term. And, you know, at the beginning, we're talking about experimental design. How do you go about designing an experiment? And one of the key things is realism, where you want it to have some sort of link with what happens in reality, but you can't make it super complicated. It has to be simple enough that it maybe focuses on one or two key predictions of the theory, for example, because the more complicated you make it, the less likely that your participants are to actually understand what is happening in the experiment. And with economic experiments, we're not allowed to deceive participants. So we can't, I know, we can't say that this is what we're looking at when we're completely not. So we try to make it so that participants actually understand the framework of the game or the experiment that they're doing, and a lot of the links with reality has to be within the design. Okay, this somewhat is analogous to what happens in real life.
Yeah. Are your students, are they looking to, one day grow up and be other professors, or what are you finding that your students are taking your classes for what benefit?
Some students take the class because they need to write a senior thesis in their senior year. In our department, all of our students write a senior thesis, and normally it's some sort of empirical exercise where they form a research question, then they gather some data, then they analyze the data, discuss it, and that's the thesis. More students are interested in designing an experiment to answer the research question rather than getting the data from somewhere else. So some of my students who are juniors or sophomores in the class are interested in potentially that route when it comes to the senior thesis. I do have a lot of seniors in my class right now taking the class for interest. At Union and the econ department, maybe 10 to 15% of our graduates go on to do further work in economics, and most of the time it's not directly after their bachelor's. So students do it for interest. Students do it because they might be using it in a future course in their thesis. Some students do it because it fits with their schedule.
Yeah, sure.
But with my current students, I think hopefully they'll utilize, if not, I'm going to do an experiment sometime in my lifetime, but at least the methodology and the thought process of how we go about analyzing and thinking about what makes a good experiment, what makes a bad experiment, that might somehow help them in something that they do.
Yeah, I'm always curious to it would be interesting to follow the path of a lot of these people and see how they move throughout the world from that point on. Because that's a lot of information and information is a powerful tool, to help you deal with even day to day. Has it changed, all the things that you've studied changed the way you make your decisions?
Yes. I mean, just economics and studying economics really has kind of framed the way in which I make decisions as being cost-benefit analysis. And sometimes that's to my detriment, but, what are the benefits of this? What are the costs of this? If the benefits outweigh the cost, then it's something worthwhile. If it's not, then it's not.
So you've moved those thought processes into your conscious brain instead of your subconscious brain, which is how most of the rest of
I know, which is what people normally do, but now it's like an explicit thing.
Yeah.
This is how I approach pretty much every decision that I make. So,
which is probably better. I mean, if you're going to quantify it, instead of an impulse-driven or a subconscious-driven,
but then
actually thinking about what you're going to do is probably the healthier choice.
When you're thinking about
you're going to go for the apple. What actually? Not the donut.
I don't know about that because I know this is the way I approach the decisions, but we all have these failings. When I was teaching a behavioral economics class, one of the examples that I always use is there's this gourmet muffin that they sell at the cafeteria at school, and I know that this gourmet muffin probably isn't that great for me. It's probably not that healthy. It's red velvet with, cheese.
Yummy.
Cream cheese.
Yeah, you put cream cheese on anything.
And then it's like you say, okay, no, it costs like $2, and maybe the benefits you get will be great in the short run, but then think about the long run. But half of the time I would go get the red velvet muffin. So it's not, as a framework for making decisions, it's great, but that is not.
Again, it's a neuroscience steps in and says why, what part of the brain is lighting up or requiring this treat versus healthy choice.
Yeah.
Which is, at the heart of the weight loss gain mechanism when we're trying to make those decisions. I look at human beings as this, very interesting species, creature roaming the planet, and I realize I look to just pick something, a chimpanzee or maybe an elephant or all these various animals, and you can see them doing the same thing, right? And some do it they do it differently. Like, for example, elephant, they're very pack oriented, they're very into their tribe, and so if one is needing help, they'll all go and help. Chimpanzees also have their tribal situation, but they're not as friendly. They're not as nice about it. They're like, I don't know, that guy's kind of a jerk. Let's leave him behind, or whatever it is, And I always think that's so fascinating. I know we spoke about mice and watching how mice make their decisions, but is there a lot of that in behavioral economics where you look at how animals make their choices?
So
even octopus, they're like, oh, hey, that snack looks good, and they'll do.
So there's not as much as I'm aware, but there's a lot of links to animal studies, that some of the findings that we see in behavioral economics that we also see with animal studies. So one game that is used in economics to kind of measure people's altruistic or fairness norms is called the dictator game. So if we're playing...
That sounds fun. You get a little hat, little mustache.
So if you're playing a dictator game, two people, one person gets an endowment, a certain amount of money, say $10, and they have the option to share some of that with the other person, and the other person has no role in the game at all. So if you have the $10, you can either keep it all for yourself, or you can send some of it to me, whatever proportion of it you'd like. Now, standard economic theory would say that a self-interested person who's interested in maximizing their own returns would keep all of the money. But consistently, people send some proportion of the money to the other individuals. And they also found that with studies with chimpanzees. So there are linkages with seeing how animals behave. Most of the studies I've seen has been with chimps, and it's very similar to what we find with humans. There's another variant of the game called the ultimatum, where now that you've sent me an offer, I can reject it completely if I think, for whatever reason, it's an unfair offer. So if you sent me $1 and keep $9 of it for yourself, I can say I reject this, and then we both get nothing. Again, standard theory might say $1 is better than 0, so I should accept anything that's above 0.
Yeah,
but
I've
that's
heard a
not
little
what
bit
we
about
found.
this.
Yeah,
It's
and again, they've done this work with chimps, and it's very similar in terms of.
But don't human beings, behave differently when they're being observed? A chimpanzee probably also has the wherewithal to know it's being observed. Other animals, maybe not so much. Mice don't care, or maybe they do. I don't know, because I'm not an animal behaviorist. But does that make a difference in the research? Because if you're watching me, and we're playing the dictator game, I'm gonna be like, oh, I don't want to be a dictator. You know what I mean? Even
so there's
has an inherent bias.
So there's levels of anonymity, and then there's levels of there's single blind or double blind studies where you don't actually know who you're playing with. You're playing with someone in the other room.
Do you know the name of the game?
No, so we normally don't refer to it within the instruction. You'll be playing the dictator game, or so that's another design principle. Keep the instructions and the framing of the instructions as neutral as possible. Good. We're not calling it the dictator game, which in itself might,
that might be a little bit of a bias.
Exactly. So we're not calling it the dictator game. We're not calling it the ultimatum game. But we frame it. It's like, you get $10, you have the chance to share it with somebody. I'm trying to remember, why do they call it the dictator game? Yeah, because you have all the power.
You have all the power, sure. Yeah.
But
it's so fascinating. Humans, huh?
I know.
Craziness. Do you have any every time I speak with a professor, I like to say, do you have any books coming out? Because I know that is part of your shtick, because you have to, of course,
no books at the moment. Well, and within economics as well, it's less book-oriented and more article and paper-oriented. Sure. So I have a few that I've sent off for review in journals, so I'm picking
journals that I can't read because y'all are fancy and you don't let us.
I think in most, not just economics, but I think in a lot of disciplines, journals are restricted access. Some specific articles.
Why is that? I know that's a tangent, but why? It seems like you would want people to read things that great minds are coming
there's probably some cost involved that they're trying to recoup, because then you sell the licenses to the libraries or
the journals or the fancy
so there's probably some cost involved there. But they do sometimes, depending on the article, have it be open access, but everything normally isn't.
As a woman, do you find yourself trying to encourage other young girls to come up in your field and things? Or
and that's something that, because there's this underrepresentation of women in economics, it's something that the discipline as a whole has been trying to work on. The American Economic Association, they've done, well, not the association, but there's a lot of studies been done of why do women kind of like shy away from economics. And some of the things that have come up is, one, there might be a confidence issue. It might be that women react poorly or more poorly to grades than men. So if a girl gets a C in an economics course, like your intro economics course, you'd say, okay, this is not for me. Versus a boy who gets a C in his economics course would be like, it's fine, I'll just move on. So that's part of it. And that's something that the discipline has been trying to work strategies. How do we try to engender more confidence in girls?
How long have you been teaching?
This is my second year.
Oh, your second year. So you don't have
really
a big scope to say. My next question is going to be: are your classes more? Are you seeing more girls in your females in your classes?
It's probably like 30 to 40%.
Oh,
I'm in my current class.
It's
good. 12 students. We have 25, like three girls and 3 boys. 3 women and 3 men, because they're pretty much
they're grown-ups.
They're grown-ups.
It is hard to see an 18-year-old as a grown-up. No offense to all 18-year-olds out there, but it just makes me feel 25. It makes me feel old every time. I'm like,
I know. So it's like I'm so out of touch with the young folks.
Kids these days.
I was trying to introduce me to, was it Venmo?
Oh yeah, Venmo's great. And I'm a big fan.
I went on the app to download it, and then I saw that it was also like there's a social media app.
Yeah, you can turn that off. I turned mine off because I don't want people knowing.
Because I was like,
no, that's an.
This is what the first thing I see when I'm trying to sign up. So that kind of like turned me off of getting it, but I probably look at it again because I'm like, why are these people putting all of their information?
Because people, that's the world we live in.
X paid Y?
Yeah, I don't for a cupcake or an apple.
I know, and I feel like the world is changing. I used to be at some point technologically savvy, and then somewhere along the lines, it just like I think when social media just kind of waved over me, and I'm like, I don't know.
And it's emoji based, which everybody loves their emojis. So
and I'm trying to figure out what do these emojis actually mean. Some of the more obscure ones.
Do you want to know something funny? All the different hands and stuff. I thought I was sending people the pointy hand, and then I looked closer because you kind of look, you just hit the thing. I was like, holy crap, I've been flipping people off. I had sent that to half a dozen people. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. They're like, oh, we thought you were being funny. I was like, no, I thought I was doing the pointy finger. Yeah, I think I had a similar experience. There's like a face that I thought was a happy face or something along those lines. Apparently it was a sarcastic face. And I'm like, so hard okay, they need to have like little captions. Skype used to have that. It would
little
be
captions with, okay, this face means that.
Somewhere on Google there's a map. That's like the C's Candy thing that you lift it up and it tells you what each thing is. Sounds like too much work. I'll just stick to the basic emojis that I know for sure. It makes life a lot easier. Kaywana, this has really been fascinating. I appreciate you taking the time
thanks for having me.
To come to Yasmin's kitchen and talk with me here in Schenectady. So is there, can you recommend a couple books just for the listeners who might be interested, laymen like myself, that lay women, I don't know, is it gender, I don't know anymore. Anyway, that might...
Yeah, so there's the Dan Ariely book. I think if you're interested in behavioral economics, the Dan Ariely book, Predictably Irrational, Richard Thaler, Nudge. Dan Ariely also has a number of other books, as does Thaler. I can't remember their names at the moment. There is... Oh my goodness.
Nudge sounds really interesting.
Daniel Kahneman, who also was a Nobel Prize winner in economics in 2002. Also very important.
Do you remember that?
Thinking Fast and Slow.
Thinking Fast and Slow.
Yes.
Okay.
Thinking Fast and Slow.
And I can put these links on heyhumanpodcast.com. Do people get very excited in your class as they learn these theories and possibilities?
I think so, hopefully. Some students would say, I've never really thought about this in this way before. And especially with the behavioral class, we talk about a lot of biases that people have when they're making decisions, and when you recognize it in your own decision making, it's like, okay, maybe that's something
that's
moving
great.
on that I can consciously at least think about.
That's great. I think the more we can facilitate global humans, the better. And I do believe that it starts with ourselves and then radiates outward, for sure.
Yes.
Any women in that pile?
Iris Bonet or Bonet. I'm probably not.
Is it B-O-N-E-T?
B-O-H-N-E-T.
Oh.
I'm not pronouncing her name correctly. So she has a book called What Works? Gender Equality by Design. So it's kind of utilizing behavioral economics and behavioral theories in kind of fashioning a workplace, for example, and things that can kind of help promote equality within the workplace.
And again, her name? Sorry.
Iris
Bonet or
Bonet. B-O-H-N-E-T.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome.
All right.
Thank you so very much.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate your time.
Lovely.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, everyone. Go out there and be global. I don't know. Thank you for listening.